All right, good afternoon, everyone. Happy Wednesday afternoon from a cold and rainy San Francisco. I am back in my apartment, but there's still a fair amount of construction being done. So if you hear drilling or pounding of some sort, um, that's what's going on. I hope that you're doing well. If you're not doing well, I hope you're at least hanging in there. Um, we're going to be talking about Anthony Giddens' theory of structuration in this class. It'll kind of be um, bringing to an end our discussion of structure and agency as we've been talking about them like in the last two classes. And then we will kind of go from there to thinking about institutions and organizations. Um, we probably will not get to that section of the class until Monday. Um, with the nuts and bolts announcements of the class, remember that you have a writing assignment that is due on Monday, the 23rd, at this class time. I look forward to reading your forum responses. I've, kind of asked you more about your experiences with institutions and, kind of questions about like structure and agency, about free will and choice, and about your own sort of like uh, background as far as like how your life chances and opportunities have been structured by the larger social forces. So I look forward to reading those, and hopefully, we can use some of that for basis for discussion in class today. Um, so without further ado, I think I will go to our reading from Anthony Giddens today, and we'll kind of like look into the perusal, and I have another poll based on an actual survey that was done just a couple of weeks ago, like a national survey. So we'll have a look at that. Let me go to the screen share. Um, Pull this up. Hopefully you can all see my screen. Um, so we'll be talking about the theory of structuration coming from Anthony Giddens in his book called The New Rules of Sociological Method. As I've said before, the title of Giddens's book that we're reading today is a play or like a callback to the work of Emile Durkheim, who wrote a book called The Rules of Sociological Method in 1895, where he kind of like tried to lay out like what sociologists should do, what sociologists should study, how they should do research, those sorts of things that he called the sociological method. And that was a time when Durkheim was really, working to establish sociology as a kind of social science. Without Durkheim's efforts, we might not be in a sociology class today. Like sociology might not be a thing. So his work was very foundational for the creation of this thing that we're all studying here. And Anthony Giddens kind of tries to pick up the torch from where Durkheim had, kind of like left off. And so his book, The New Rules of Sociological Method, lays out what he calls a theory of structuration, in which he's attempting to um, like kind of balance the relationship between structure and agency to show how structure and agency are interrelated with one another, how they interact with one another. Um, and he is, as we have said before, one of the most celebrated and influential sociologists who is still living to this day. As we see, here, as I talked about last time, he has been, honored by the English government. He was an advisor to the Tony Blair in the Labour Party when Tony Blair was the Prime Minister in England during like the 1990s, early 2000s. Um, so this is somebody who, you know, as I said last time, is the single most frequently cited author on college syllabi for sociology courses. Who's written 34 books that have been translated into 29 languages, and you know, just had a really important influence on sociology in our times in the same way that Durkheim had an influence on sociology in previous times. So we're going to get to his theory of structuration, and I want to start with like the first two paragraphs of the reading because this really sets up what he's trying to do very nicely. He starts by talking about the schools of interpretive sociology and talking about how these have made essential contributions to the logic and method of the social sciences. When he says interpretive sociology, it's kind of like what we've been studying the last couple of weeks here with like symbolic interactionism, with uh, Irving Goffman's, dramaturgical theory, with these kinds of micro sociology, as we have called them. So when he, uses that term interpretive sociology, you can kind of think of it in those terms, in terms of these things that we've been studying to begin the semester here. And he says, in summary, these are the following. The social world, unlike the world of nature, has to be grasped as a skilled accomplishment of active human subjects. The constitution of this world as meaningful, incountable, or intelligible depends upon language, regarded not simply as a system of signs or symbols, but as a medium of practical activity. The social scientist of necessity draws upon the same sorts of skills as those whose conduct he seeks to analyze in order to describe it. So we've been saying that this, fundamentally involves a process of interpretation, interpreting how people make meaning out of the things that are the actions that they're taking or the interactions that they're having, the way that sociologists have to like kind of put themselves in the shoes of the people that they're studying to understand the way that they are interpreting and finding meaning in the world and then acting upon that meaning in the world. So interpretive sociology is very concerned with like language, with symbolic systems, with what we call culture, these ways in which people make meaning and understand and interpret the world around them, and then act on the basis of those interpretations and meaning. And then in the second paragraph, he says basically like these are, but they're like shortcomings. He says with this approach that it gives that it's kind of like um, imperfect. Pardon me while I'm sort of messing around with this light to try to get the situation not so creepy looking. Let me try to turn on another light in this room. Okay. Mm, all right. Well, at least I think that's a little bit better. I'm sorry that it gives me this weird kind of glow if you're watching the screen. Um, so he says like these shortcomings. He says basically like he starts the paragraph by saying these insights derive from like a kind of philosophical idealism. So within philosophy, a kind of an idealistic kind of approach that emphasizes, kind of like more the ideas that people have or like their consciousness, their forms of meaning. And so this kind of interpretive sociology, in other words, is related to an even more long-standing kind of philosophy, a school of philosophical idealism. That's where interpretive sociology basically has its roots. And Giddens like goes along and he says, well, but there's a certain shortcoming to this. It's not that it's wrong, it's that it's kind of like incomplete, right? And he says, that these derived in this first sentence um, that they manifest the traditional shortcomings of that philosophy when transferred to the field of social analysis. And that is a concern with meaning to the exclusion of the practical involvements of human life in material activity, a tendency to seek to explain all human conduct in terms of motivating ideals at the expense of the causal conditions of action, and then a failure to examine social norms in relation to asymmetries of power and divisions of interest in society. So here he's like kind of outlining these kind of shortcomings we can unpack in each of these like three, clauses from the sentence. He says like um, the exclusion of the practical involvements of human life in material activity. So, in other words, one problem with interpretive sociology is that it doesn't take into account the sort of more practical matters, especially like what we would call economics, the way that people work and labor to um, take care of their material needs, their food, their housing, their healthcare, and so forth. Interpretive sociology isn't very good at looking at like economic structures, in other words. It doesn't consider the practical material aspects of social life. It's more concerned with like language and meaning and interpretation and consciousness. But the other side of the coin is like material economic conditions. And interpretive sociology is not so good at explaining that. That's essentially what he's saying. Um, Secondly, at the expense of the causal conditions of action, right? So that it's not very good at interpretive sociology, lacks a kind of like understanding how certain causes, like the relationships of cause and effect in society, how certain kinds of structures or forces have effects in in our world, so that like how, for example, as agents, as people taking action, we are ourselves, the product, the result, the effect of certain kinds of socioeconomic forces. It doesn't, it's not good at taking those things into account. And then finally, and I would say most importantly, is this last part of the sentence, a failure to examine social norms in relation to asymmetries of power and divisions of interest in society. It's not very good, in other words, at explaining how it is that certain groups and certain individuals have more power than others in society. How white people versus non-white people have, that where there's an asymmetry of power in the society, or men and women, an asymmetry of power, and perhaps even an asymmetry of interests when it comes to class relationships, the asymmetry of power between the bosses and their workers, the asymmetry of interests. Bosses have an interest in keeping wages as low as possible. Workers have the opposite interest in trying to increase their wages. So all of this is a way of saying that interpretive sociology is good at like the micro parts of social life, but not very good at explaining the macro sociological aspects of life, especially the economic, material dimensions of social life. And so what Giddens is saying is that we need a theory that can bridge these two, that can show how the micro and the macro are related. And in the terms that we've been discussing in this class, how structure and agency are interrelated, how these are interconnected. That is his project. That is the puzzle that he is trying to solve. That is the sort of, I would say, like the most enduring debate or problem that sociologists have faced for over 100 years, is like, what is this relationship between structure and agency? What is this relationship between like individuals and society? That is like what his project is sort of all about. So to try to show again like how important it is to be able to kind of grasp the role of structure and especially economics in our lives, I have this poll that's based on a survey that was done just a couple of weeks ago. I thought it was really interesting. And I'd like us to kind of like mimic the poll and then look at the way that people around the country responded to these same questions, because they really have an important bearing on how economic structures impact people's life chances and the choices that we make about, whether to buy a house or start a family, or what kind of job we can get. These things that really personally impact us all in our daily lives, that are kind of like determined by this larger structure. It's kind of like the way that we've been speaking, discussing in the last week or so about the relationship between structure and agency as a kind of menu, right? Like this, we don't like get to choose what's on the menu. That is kind of chosen for us by the structure. And then as agents, we are working with a limited set of options as far as like choices that we can make. And I would say that as far as the structures that we are living under today, the economy is the most important. That economics is the thing that really determines like what's on the menu, like it really determines like what are the choices or the options that people have in terms of these really fundamental things about like, you know, owning a home, starting a family, getting a job, you're, these things that are very personal to us, right? That are structured by forces that we don't really control. So without further ado, let me take you to this poll. Okay, I've launched the poll. It is a five-question poll. So, the first question, in your view, among middle class Americans, economic opportunities, it should just say economic opportunities, not economics, but economic opportunities have been increasing, decreasing, staying the same, not sure. Likewise, the same question, but this time for wealthy Americans. In your view, among wealthy Americans, economic opportunities have been increasing, decreasing, staying the same, not sure. Third question, third through the fifth question is basically asking you to compare your generation, whatever it is, with previous generations. So the third question asked us about buying a home. Um, Compared to previous generations, it is harder for your generation to buy a home. Do you agree, disagree, not sure? Compared to previous generations, it is harder for your generation to get a good job, however you define good job. That's a totally subjective thing. Agree, disagree, not sure. Compared to previous generations, it is harder for your generation to raise a family. Agree, disagree, not sure. All right, give a little. Let me just give another like minute in case I see that four of you have responded here. I'll just give another minute for the others. Again, as I said last time, I cannot see your responses. They are totally anonymous. And please do answer with, kind of like what you think as opposed to, like what you think I want you to think, you know. Very interesting. This is like, I would say that this is pretty close to unanimous opinion here. All right. Okay. So this was a poll that was done by CBS and YouGov, I think like at the beginning of this month in February. And they asked a number of questions about the economy and just like what people thought about the future and stuff like that. Um, and it was similarly, as the responses here indicate, like pretty despairing about people among people as far as like people pretty are pessimistic, generally speaking, about the economic future and about opportunities that people have. Um, Here's what the poll itself looks like. Try to move this out of the way. I hope that you can see that. Holler at me if you can. So the first one asked, among your about economic opportunities. So I split this into two questions because can't really replicate this. Thanks, Joe. Um, so people, generally speaking, for the middle class. Now I put middle class in quotes here because it's in some ways a kind of a problematic term, and it kind of depends on how you interpret it. But I wanted to replicate the exact language of the poll. So the Americans in general said that that it was increasing. 16% of Americans thought it was increasing, but 53% said that it was decreasing, and 31% staying the same. So this is like the majority of people, a slight majority, but a majority of people in America believe that econ class people. Whereas for wealthy people, the second question, um, the majority of Americans think that economic opportunities have been increasing. Uh, and only 8% believe that they have been decreasing. Go ahead, Jill.
Yeah. So, when I was taking this survey, I had to think of like the concept of what wealth is, right? And from when I was a
Yeah,
kid, the people that I would perceive as wealthy, their opportunities, I would say, are decreasing. However, the people that are in like the ultra elite wealthy is
yeah,
increasing. And so it was honestly, I answered not sure because it in a simple survey like that, you're like, okay, well, how do you conceptualize what wealth is to you?
yeah. And, and it's a question that like sociologists would call like relative versus absolute. So like people
Yeah,
that are relatively wealthy relative to you, like say like a small business owner,
right.
like yeah, maybe they are facing like heavier taxation,
Hmm.
property costs,
More
housing
bureaucracy,
costs.
more city tax, etc. Or
Yeah,
even the families that I grew up with going over to their house, and I considered them to be like a wealthier family, are now living in like that borderline of middle class to poverty.
yeah, yeah,
So it
exactly.
just,
Yeah, that
oh
yeah.
yeah,
Um, Yeah, I think that when they ask people that question on the survey, the way that it's worded, they probably think, that people are going to imagine like the Elon Musks and Jeff Bezos of the world, like people that they don't necessarily know,
the
but they,
CEOs and etc.
yeah, exactly, like the people they know about, but not necessarily like know personally. Um, it is a good kind of reminder about like how surveys, it matters so much how you word them. Like the way that the wording of the survey can really alter the findings, and so you have to be careful. And I say this, like as a sociologist, and knowing that some of you may end up doing this kind of like polling data or serving survey data, because it's a thing that as a sociology major you're kind of like trained to do. And so this is a reminder that like how you word things is really important. So for this one, I because I wanted to compare the results of our class with the poll out, the national poll. I just used the same wording or as close to the same wording as I could. That's why I put like in your view. So I didn't want people to be like, oh, is this like like a sociology question? Like, am I supposed to know the answer, objectively? I was trying to ask people more kind of like subjectively, like about, your view of things, um, because I think that that was the intent of the poll. Yeah, go ahead, Kai.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, I forgot what the initial question was, but I do think that, you know, definitely this time period, as far as like wealth inequality is pretty bad. But like, if you compare it to like the Gilded Age or like other time periods, like,
Yeah.
it's not, it's on trend, but it's not as bad as it was then. So I guess it's all like relative, but I guess in like if you compare it to like the 50s or something like that, like I feel like, oh yeah, this is like much worse.
Yeah. So that's another thing with survey questions too, is like it depends on the benchmark that you're using to compare something with. So like yeah, if you go, back, you could say like, well, things are things are less unequal today than they were in ancient Rome. You know, like, or, it really depends on what, your point of reference is in terms of comparison. So this is another thing with like wording, you know.
Yeah.
And so like the next question is like kind of do this compared to previous generations. Well, I don't know which previous generations.
Like, what
Um,
are we comparing it to? Like, I feel like if it said like contemporary, like, or like gave like a threshold, it would be like you'll get more of like an accurate answer. But like you said, like if I compare it, like even the second question, like, or I don't re remember what it says, but I guess it's just all relative to what you're comparing it to. But if you're comparing it to like, recent, like within the past one, like I would say like 70 years or something, yeah.
yeah, and I think that's the intent of the question. I think, like, for example, this like compared to previous generations, it is harder for your generation to buy a home. Well, it's like, um, if I compared it to my parents, like baby boomers, who bought like a house in California for, like $40,000 or whatever, like, yeah, it's a lot harder. If I compare it to like my grandparents, maybe who grew up during the Depression, then like, I don't know, maybe it's a different answer.
Right, right, right.
But I think it's basically like asking, it's another way of asking like, are things getting better or worse? Like, is it getting easier to buy a home or harder to buy a home? And so the general answer was like 83% say that it's harder to buy a home. 77% say it's harder to raise a family, which I thought was really interesting. Um, and you guys were pretty like split on that, although there's some disagreement. I would love to hear about the disagreement with that, because I can imagine like somebody like why somebody would kind of like disagree. Like it depends on again, it depends on the generation, and like there were certain obstacles to raising a family back in the day that we might be taking for granted today. I think that's a conceivable, um, legitimate perspective on things. Yeah, go ahead, Jill.
I was gonna say, like, as far as raising a family goes right now, it's I have one 5-year old son, and like most of our challenges are like childcare, et cetera, trying to plan schedules around, two working people in the house and things like that. Um, we're looking, at schools right now, and it's, what school do we want to put our kid into? And the one that's in our area of residence isn't the best school in the area, et cetera, et cetera. And you're online and you have all of these like social pressures to be like, okay, my kid has to go to this, and you have to make sure that they do this and that and the other thing. And between childcare, struggle,
Yeah,
um, things like that. When your kid gets sick, who's going to take the day off? Things like that. So there's a lot. I think it's really hard to raise a family. Not to mention the other worldly problems that you're like, was this the right decision?
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
putting my kid into this world right now. So
yeah. I think there's probably like long-term and short-term kinds of issues that both make it harder to raise a family. It's like
yeah,
like the child care kind of issue is really, you know, weighs on a lot of people.
yes.
Yeah, I think that's a real
One of my
serious.
coworkers, her infant's daycare, actually, the owner just got really sick and decided she was going to take less children and was like, sent her a text over the weekend. And so they were scrambling for like, oh no, we have to find a new babysitter like within the weekend. And they're all full. It's crazy.
Uh, yeah, yeah, that's a good
So,
example. Uh,
mhm.
yeah, it's like I'm thinking too, the the success of the Mamdani mayoral campaign, one of the
Yeah.
things that he promised was like basically city subsidized childcare.
Yeah.
And that was probably one of his most successful things about,
Talking points.
yeah,
Yeah.
about the affordability crisis. I mean, this is, in other words, this poll is kind of like not about the affordability crisis in the country
Yeah.
right now. You know,
Definitely.
housing, childcare, and healthcare. You know, all of those are things that are increasing at a faster pace than
Than
wages.
wages.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Than wages and opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. You know, even the price of food and basic necessities, you know, which haven't gone up at the same pace, but have now, you know, in the last, few years have really increased as well. Yeah. Go ahead, Kai.
I feel like I guess I'm just wondering why we keep as like a society like keep making the same mistakes because like this issue that's occurring like it's been occurring, throughout American history, like fluctuations like we talk about Marx in his time and
Yeah.
and I'm just like this isn't anything new, like this it keeps occurring throughout human history and I'm just like like, is it ever going to end, I guess, or is it always going to just be like this up and then it's down and then it's up like a roller coaster, Is that just like how it is with like wages and inequality and everything like that?
Yeah. Well, um, if you look at like childcare and healthcare, you realize quickly that other societies have way better ways of dealing with these things. You know, that there are, you know, that there is more public subsidized childcare and that people don't spend nearly as much on healthcare in other countries as they do in the United States. And the problem with that is not, it's not necessarily that like, you know, we haven't figured it out. It's that like health insurance companies and like private for-profit healthcare companies have so much power in this society, including the power to lobby and, you know, make their interests felt in the government. Likewise with housing, you know, the real estate industry and the power of, you know, now you have like these private equity firms that are buying up housing, you know, across the country. They're buying homes and jacking up the cost of housing for, you know, ordinary people, making it increasingly prohibitive to buy a house, like not just in California or San Francisco, but like all over the country now is becoming more like San Francisco and California in terms of like the cost of housing, outpacing the increase in wages. So, you know, it's kind of like the reason, I guess this also brings it back to Marx. Like the reason that we're having these problems is like, you know, corporations and for-profit private companies have so much power in this society, and regular working people just don't have enough. And that's why we're having this like affordability crisis. I think the Mamdani thing is really interesting because it's kind of an experiment of like, you know, is it possible to mitigate some of this, to turn things back in the other direction in favor of the interests of working people? I know he's certainly going to try. But he's up against a really powerful class of billionaires, you know, who don't want, they don't want rent control. They don't want to pay more taxes for childcare. they don't want Medicare for all or socialized medicine or you know these kinds of things. They're adamantly opposed to it. Um, so I don't think it's really a question of like a technical question of like why can't we do it? It's kind of like a political question of like working people and ordinary people just don't have enough power, and we have this class of billionaires and corporations that have so much power over every aspect of the society. Um, Thanks, Kai. Did you have something to add to this?
No, like you're absolutely right, I guess. Like the CEO of like my company, the company that I work for, like we're going through contract negotiations, and when Trump got elected, our CEO gave him $1 million, and I know that if we voted no on our first TA, if we vote no again, then it's gonna have to, it's gonna be up to the government, and we have a government who's very much anti-union.
Mhm.
So yeah, like it's one of those like you wash my back, I'll wash your back type thing, like I don't even know how like I guess lobbying at its core makes sense, but it's completely like gotten out of pocket, because like I could lobby, like me and a couple of people can technically lobby for something, but we don't have the resources to like, really make like an input or like a stand against anything. So I don't know. It's like a monster at this point, that
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think we all kind of feel that frustration in a lot of ways. That just the powerlessness. It's just like, even when we're like, you know, we can be like, oh, why can't we be more like Sweden or Denmark and like, give new parents, a longer maternity or paternity leave. Why can't we get like 6 week vacations like the Europeans do? Why can't, we have, health insurance or, health coverage like every other advanced industrialized country, like, Canada does, like all of Europe does. Why don't we have these things? Um, it really comes down to the question of power. Yeah, go ahead, Kai.
And like not to sidetrack, but like I could be wrong, like tell me if I'm wrong, right? But like I can't help, and I think I was when we had the other class, I kind of talked about this too. Like we're talking about AI and everything like that. Like I want like when I was talking about like, Mark's error and everything like that, I'm like, it's like the same themes, it's the same thing that just keeps happening. And I can't help but feel like, and I could be so wrong with like the introduction to like automation and AI, like how it's taking so many jobs and how fast like it's like learning things. And like if people don't have money to put into the economy, like it doesn't matter like who you are, like it's gonna collapse, which we don't want. And like a part of me, maybe it's like wishful thinking, like thinks like maybe not like in like I think maybe like 80, 90 years from now, like what if due to AI that there is like, like what is it, like universal basic income or something like that to kind of like I don't know if that's just like wishful thinking, but like maybe with AI it's gonna kind of like force change, kind of like the Great Depression kind of forced like, like new policies to be created that's we still have now, and I'm like wondering like, okay, if AI comes in, maybe it'll be something similar and maybe like their big creation will like implode on itself, or
Yeah,
not implode on itself, but like work against them.
yeah. Um, can I actually show you the poll? I didn't ask you guys this one, but this is in the national poll. They also asked like secure do you feel in your job, and then how easy would it be to find another job, and then finally the impact of AI on jobs in the U.S. So they're asking people kind of like about these exact things that you're talking about, Kai, with like the sort of the automation of labor, with the impact of AI. And the vast majority of people, it's like a 3-to-1 margin here almost, say that like AI is going to decrease the number of jobs. That this is just like asking people what they believe. Um, and in many respects, this looks to be the case that like, especially for what have been called like, white collar jobs or professional jobs, that this technology is going to automate them and make them unnecessary and redundant, like software engineers and people like that, people who write code. It's kind of ironic because this was supposed to be like the big growth industry, in this economy for a long time, was like, writing code and being a software programmer, that was like a good job. And now all of a sudden with AI, like, the bottom is dropping out of that field. And so there will be certainly other fields. I often think about how this is going to impact higher education, and how it is already impacting higher education and like my job, you know. So you see that like the majority of the people are like, pretty pessimistic about these very things that you're discussing. How, if you lost your job, how easy would it be to find a job that you would want? And 71% of people say it would be difficult to find a job, um, that you would want, as opposed to only 29% of people who say it would be easy. How secure do you feel currently in your job? Um, Only 28% people say that they're very secure, and like almost that many, 20% say that they're not very or secure or at all secure. So there's, I think, a pretty prevailing sense of like anxiety in the society right now, because of these new kinds of technologies. And as you said, Kai, like that is not a new story. This is something that Marx talked about in Capital. The use of technology to replace human labor, the automation of labor. In Marx's time, it would have been the way that like factories were using assembly lines and things like that to replace manufacturing labor, making stuff. In our time, it's like artificial intelligence is going to replace the need for mental labor, for like what used to be, called like white collar work, or professional work, like intellectual labor, is going to be made redundant by some of these technologies. Perhaps even like creative labor, like making movies or television shows or music, or art. Conceivably, AI can replace a lot of that labor too. So whereas in Marx's time it was like, and up until recently in our time too, it was like the elimination of manufacturing or physical labor. Now it's mental labor that's in the crosshairs of the new technology, and that's a pretty scary proposition. To your thing about universal basic income, that is definitely, I would say, it's a possibility. I think, you know, especially if people, ordinary working people, organize it and demand it, it certainly could be done. It's already been shown that it can be done. We did a little bit of that during the pandemic. During COVID, there were, remember Trump bucks, like during 2020. We all got like a check, you
Yeah.
know? Remember that? Like it's been done. Other countries do it. Alaska has been doing it for a long time. Alaska gives people a check, basically just because they live in Alaska. And there's just like all this oil and like, like natural resources that they're extracting. Like universal basic income is definitely like a reality. It's just like, again, it's a question of political will. People have to, we got to have power to the people for them to be able to demand and organize for that. Um, to a certain extent, like corporations, they need people to have money in their pockets. So this was like the thing with Trump bucks is like, if you give money to people, they're going to spend it. And that is an economic stimulus in its own right, right? Like the economy is going to collapse if no one has a job and no one can afford like an iPhone or, their heating bill or whatever. Like that's unsustainable economically. So to a certain extent, like the billionaires have an interest in giving us money if for no other reason than knowing that we're going to spend it, and that you have to have a consumer, you have to have at least some amount of consumer spending in order for an economy to be functional. So we can't all go unemployed and starving and homeless, you know, like it's like there's obviously a certain amount of that they can tolerate, but like we can't have like 95% unemployment, like it's just like if no one has a job, then they're going to find some way of stimulating consumer spending. So that kind of UBI is like on the menu as well. My point in doing this poll was just again to for us to think about the way that these structural forces, like really shape e- even these like kind of personal decisions and these personal aspects of our lives, like having a family, raising kids, having a home, what kind of job we have, how we spend our time. All of those are things that like, we have a menu of options, but we don't get to write the menu for. We didn't choose to be born in this time and place. There are these larger structures, these larger systemic forces that are kind of weighing upon us. And that is very germane to what Anthony Giddens and these folks are talking about. In the uh, in the New Rules of Sociological Method, he sort of is talking here, as we said, about the need for this kind of a method, and then he gives us like a series of propositions. These are like basically the conclusions that he draws about what the new rules of sociological method should be, and he kind of numbers, like uh, outlines them A, B, C, and D here. And so I'd like to just like end the last 20 minutes of class just by looking at those propositions. So it starts with like A, sociology is not concerned with a pre-given universe of objects, but with one which is constituted or produced by the active doings of subjects. Human beings transform nature socially, and by humanizing it, they transform themselves. But they do not, of course, produce the natural world, which is constituted as an object world independently of their existence. This second sentence is actually cribbed pretty much directly from Karl Marx, about the way that human beings transform nature socially, basically meaning that like human beings labor, we work to transform nature in order to meet our needs. And we do that in a social way, in a collective way, like a cooperative way or some kind of social way. We don't do it alone, right? We work together with other people to transform nature to create the things that we need to live, like food, shelter, healthcare, and so forth. right? So we're always working with some element of the natural world, and we're doing it in a kind of social fashion. And in the process, we are then transforming ourselves. So there is a reciprocal process in which people are working with the natural world. And in the process, we are kind of like transforming our own human nature, right? So there's a process of interaction, a reciprocity that Giddens is trying to explain here, and more or less like paraphrasing something that Marx said back in 1844 in the economic and philosophic manuscripts about the relationship between people and nature. The second proposition under B here is also pretty much cribbed directly from Marx. In fact, it's a thing that I've said in previous classes. I think the last two classes I've said this thing, that men produce society, but they do so as historically located actors and not under conditions of their own choosing. The direct quote from Marx, as I've been invoking it, is people make history, but not under conditions of their own choosing. And so this is, again, a way of trying to solve the Rubik's Cube of sociology, like the puzzle of sociology, the relationship between structure and agency. So this is the sort of like the proposition that he gives us, the idea that the realm of human agency is bounded. So again, like this is the kind of menu metaphor. Like we do have agency, we do have choice, but it's bounded. It's within certain limits. It's within certain borders or parameters that we can then kind of choose from, but we don't really get to like choose, what's on the menu. I've been thinking about this metaphor just because we've been talking about it a lot, and maybe another way to think about it is like a game. You have, as a player, you have all kinds of options for how to play a game, but you don't get to choose the rules. The rules are objective and exist independently of you. We inherit the rules, right? But we don't necessarily like we inherit the rules, and then we get to choose how to play within those bounds, within those boundaries. Kind of, reminds me of that, thing like, don't hate the player, hate the game, kind of thing. Like you can't blame people for what they do to try to maximize their interests within a certain bounded rules of the game. You got to hate the game, not the player. I don't know. I don't know if that's a thing that people really say anymore, but I remember it from a while ago. Anyway, so people produce society, but they do so as historically located actors and not under conditions of their own choosing. Secondly, he says structures must be conceptualized as simply placing constraints, must not be conceptualized as simply placing constraints upon human agency, but as enabling. This is what I call the duality of structure. This is a thing that Giddens is really known for, the duality of structure. And what he means is that structures both enable and constrain us at the same time. So what does that mean? To constrain us is pretty obviously, self-evident. The way that societies or structures constrain us, they limit us, they repress us, they tell us what we can't do. They make certain things like illegal, immoral, punishable. Structures make, as we've been saying, are, kind of like the limited menu of choices that we have. And so in that sense, they constrain us, they limit us. They, to some extent, like repress us. But they also enable us. This is the other part of the thing. So Giddens is like, yeah, we all know that like society limits us, but it also enables us in certain kinds of ways. And that part we have to kind of like think about a little bit more. Like, how is it that like societies actually make certain things possible? You know, like a good example is with language. Like, in order for us to communicate and even for us to like express ourselves, we have to have like a socially shared language. We have to have at least like some shared agreement in a social setting that like certain kinds of, words mean certain kinds of things. If we didn't have that, if we just, like woke up one day and we're like, I'm going to speak my own language today. Like, I'm not going to, I'm just going to make up some words, and like, who cares if people don't understand, you know, I've, I've run out of F's to give. I'm just going to use my own language today. You probably get institutionalized in a mental home like pretty quickly if you decided you woke up and decided to do that. Language presupposes a certain kind of like social milieu, that we share certain kinds of assumptions. Or the example that, some of you put in the chat in perusal is about like traffic lights and stop signs and stuff. If we didn't have those kinds of constraints, those certain things that say no, or a red light, we wouldn't be able to drive because like people would be, there would just be like chaos and it would be really dangerous and there would be all kinds of accidents and so forth. So it's only because we have those constraints that we are enabled to, you know, um, to transport ourselves. And likewise with language or like with music, you have certain kinds of like rules, and there's a certain set of like shared meanings and assumptions, and we can only kind of maneuver within those insofar as those shared rules and those shared understandings exist in society. So, in other words, without these things, we would be pretty like powerless. We wouldn't be able to like communicate. We wouldn't be able to even like express ourselves. And we probably wouldn't be able to like live. We wouldn't be able to survive without at least some degree of social cooperation. And that cooperation presupposes a certain amount of like communication and a shared language. Another way of saying this is like we live in a society. We are social beings. For better or for worse, we need each other. We are interdependent with one another. We cannot exist or survive on our own. And the problem with, I guess, like those rational actor models from economics is that they all presuppose that we are these like little islands of self-interest, who are all trying to like kind of maximize our rewards and minimize our risks. But the sociological lesson is like, no, like that is just not possible. That we exist only in relation with one another. We exist in a society. We are interdependent and we need one another. So I had to go on a little screed about that. Um, and then he goes on to part C and says like, okay, the sociological observer cannot make social life available as a phenomenon for observation, independently of drawing upon his knowledge of it as a resource where he constitutes it as a topic of investigation. This is quite a mouthful. Um, but basically, what he's saying here has to do with kind of like the rules of sociological method, like what sociologists should do, and how that kind of differs from other sciences. So, in the natural sciences, like in biology and chemistry and physics and so forth, the observer, the scientist, stands apart from the thing that they are studying. They're maybe studying it under a microscope, right? Or they're studying it at some kind of distance. And there is, like a boundary between the researcher and the thing that they are studying. And that allows that researcher to be more kind of like objective, to sort of stand apart from the thing. In sociology, that's not really possible. We as sociologists are part of the very thing that we are studying. There is no like way for us to look under things under the microscope, you know. There is no like neutral space for us to stand back from. Instead, what we must do is to actually, in some ways, do the opposite. We must put ourselves in the position of the people that we are studying to see things from their point of view, to put ourselves in their shoes, as the saying goes, you know, to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but like the point is just like to see things from someone else's perspective, you know, and only then will we really be able to understand why they do the things that they do, why they think the things that they think, you know. Only then will we be able to truly understand and interpret our the activities of the people that we study. And even then, it's likely to be very imperfect. You know, even then there are all kinds of like cultural biases and sociologists bring a lot of like unquestioned like things that they take for granted, their own kind of like uh, unchecked bias into looking at a particular situation, and it often colors the way that they interpret other people's actions. So it's really hard to do this, to put yourself in somebody's shoes, because we already have our own like baggage of perception. We already have our own, biases and experiences that that make it impossible, or at least very difficult, to be like objective observers who are just like looking at things through a neutral microscope. So this is what Giddens is kind of saying as far as like a method of sociological analysis, particularly when it concerns this kind of thing about um, like interpretive sociology. And then he wraps up with this final thing about the double hermeneutic. Hermeneutic, when you see this word, it just simply means interpretation. Hermeneutics is like a field of philosophy that is concerned with interpretation, like how to interpret certain kinds of texts, like certain, like the Bible or the Quran or something like that. Hermeneutics is basically the philosophy of interpretation. And so this is where he kind of like wraps up here with this idea of a double hermeneutic, as like sociology is, the process of interpreting as people themselves are interpreting certain kinds of situations. And so there's a kind of a reciprocal, interactive dynamic at work there. Okay, so I think that pretty much takes us through Anthony Giddens for the day, Lord Giddens, and his rules of sociological method. Thank you to those of you who participated, especially in the poll and survey for today and the discussion. I thought we had a really good discussion around that poll and about, surveying in general. I look forward to talking to you next week. We'll be looking at the question of institutions. Institutions kind of builds on this discussion we've been having about structure and agency. So until then, I bid you a good rest of the week, and I will see you on Monday. Bye, all.
Bye. Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.